everyone, and welcome back to the Endgame class. As always, my name is Caleb Denby, and today I am going to continue looking at the games of Bobby Fischer, specifically in his historic tournament in the 1963/64, ran a bit into the 1964 year, I believe, that United States Championship where he went 11-0-0. No draws, no losses, only wins, and that's the way we like it. Now, in the road to 2000, I took a look at how sort of Bobby was outplaying his opponents in sort of every facet of the game. You know, getting more activity, playing good positional chess, and here I want to take a look at his round one game that I briefly mentioned. So, round one was against Edmar Mednis, who again is one of those players that I'm sure was around back in the day in the US Championships, playing very good chess for the United States, but not really a household name like Fischer or Reshevsky or Byrne. And in this game, I think in round one, Mednis was perhaps putting on more pressure than Fischer faced kind of in the rest of the tournament, right? Most of Fischer's games went very, very cleanly, and sort of it was difficult to find spots when he was ever really that much worse. But Mednis put on the pressure in this game, and we'll see how Fischer managed to turn it around by trading into a good endgame. So normally in this class, I skip straight through the entire game until we get to the endgame, but I wanted to show a little bit more of this one to highlight when weaknesses were created and sort of how both players were approaching the position. So with respect to the endgame, that is. So we had an Italian game, which I am going to skip through a lot of this because, you know, it's not an openings class, it is an endgames class, but there's a nice little tactic here that Fischer does play, which highlights that there's this d5 fork if white were to capture back on e4. So queen e2, d5, and moving straight along, Bobby is just leaving these pieces sort of en prise. Then he takes on f3, and white decides to play pawn takes f3. Notably, if queen takes f3, then I believe this would be a bit stronger for black because the white queen could not recapture on c4. So g takes f3. And this is the move that really dictates the balance of the game at this point. So what happens when you play a move like g takes f3? Well, it's important to understand that when things like this happen, you sort of immediately are conceding that if you trade into an endgame, this is going to be a very, very relevant weakness, a very important weakness, and you may lose the game because of that weakness. So that is going to be the character of the game from here on out. Mednis looking to apply pressure with pieces on the board with activity, and Fischer looking to negate that pressure and get to some sort of position where the weaknesses will be a bit more blatant in white's camp. And I think that's why Fischer ends up doing well in this game. First and foremost, d takes c4. Fischer decides, okay, it's time, I got to take my piece back. White's idea with g takes was to be able to recapture this pawn. And notably, that is white taking a pawn back. White is not up a pawn. It is now even material, and we see that white's structure is, by pretty much every stretch, a little bit worse than black's. Black has no weaknesses, all the pawns on their starting squares, and white is sort of looking at weaknesses sort of everywhere, right? But that's not to say that white is doing badly here. Why isn't white doing badly here? Well, because white has extra space, and that extra space is how white must, that's the advantage white must use to try and prove that their position isn't bad. Fischer started with the move queen h4, and again, I don't want to spend too much time here because it is an endgame class, and this is not an endgame. King b1 was played, and now queen f4, so Fischer using the squares in front of isolated pawns for his pieces. We see d5 now by white, and this is sort of the right idea so far. White needs to take this extra space and to use it to do something with the pieces. So we have knight e5, queen takes c7, rook a c8, Fischer getting active. If queen takes b7, by the way, this would be fine, but then you might see Fischer going after the king a little bit. We saw queen d6 instead. Now rook c d8, again chasing the queen. They repeated once, and then Fischer brings the rook from f over to d8. Queen e7 now, and Fischer takes the pawn back on f3 that he lost on c7. And now we have the move d6, okay? And once this pawn gets to d6, everything's sort of out the window, okay? So all that stuff about white having slightly extra space, playing for activity, black, playing against the weaknesses, that's sort of out the window. So what's the character of the game now? Well, white's not playing necessarily for activity, although that is still a big part of it. White is playing to queen the d pawn, right? This d pawn is passed, and it's 2 little squares away from becoming a queen. And so the question now for black is, how should you play against this d pawn? And you can sort of arrive at this answer using some knowledge of endgames. So, chat room, what do you think? How should black be playing against this d pawn in this game? And yeah, hello to everyone in the chat. Thank you for the kind words, as always. But what to do? What to do for Bobby Fischer? It's not so easy. I would be a little bit scared if I was playing black in this game. D-pawn is a little bit frightening to me. Great Wolf says, let's trade all the pieces off. So there is this principle in chess: when you have less space, you should attempt to trade pieces. And that does hold true here, although I think black is looking to trade 2 very specific pieces in particular. And those pieces are the queens. Black wants to get the queens off the board. Why does black want to get the queens off the board? Well, this queen is a very mobile defender of the d-pawn. It can sort of defend it from anywhere on the board using the long diagonals. And it can also apply pressure to the black king. So with queens on the board, white is allowed a little bit more flexibility in regards to the d-pawn, because the queen can be used to defend it and also put pressure on the king's side at the same time. So with the queen on the board, dual threats around the black king, as well as defending the d-pawn and perhaps threatening to push it forward even further. Now, what were to happen if queens were off the board? Well, that's where it sort of becomes relevant to an endgame class. If queens are off the board, then it very much becomes an argument of the d-pawn being overextended. And that is the imbalance of the game right now. If black can get the queens off the board, then black should just be better, in my opinion, because this d-pawn is so far into black's camp. There's one particular piece that is going to be able to help round up this pawn, and that piece is the king. In these endgames, the fewer major pieces on the board, the more active the king can become. So black is looking to trade off the queens, even looking to trade off a set of rooks, so that the king can come into the game and successfully capture the d-pawn with a pawn advantage for black. So with that in mind, what moves should black be looking at here? So a few people in the chat are saying knight e5, and knight e5 is a fine move, but I don't actually think it's the best move. So as Chess King in the chat is saying, fork the king and queen on e4. I don't know what you mean by that. That would be, okay, I see. So if we had knight d2, then queen takes knight would be great, because we have this idea, but we don't have knight d2, because this rook is there. But that idea sort of exists. I do think the best move in this case, the most principled move, is actually just the move queen e5. Why queen e5? Well, you want to get the queens off the board, as I've been saying. And that's, just the very simple reason why I think this is the best move in the position. As Chess King did also point out, this would be sort of a bad idea for white. And so white is either going to have to let black take on e7, which black doesn't necessarily have to do, or can just take on e5. And after this, I do think black is going to be slightly better. I don't know if black is winning yet, because there's a lot of work left to be done before you can actually capture a pawn on d6, but certainly this is a step in the right direction for the black pieces. Now, in the game, Bobby Fischer actually did play knight e5, but I think this move is simply a little bit wrong. I think white has some advantage after this. Rook h to e1 is played, now rook d7 is played, and white, believe it or not, was +2 in this case. White could have very seriously put the pressure on on Bobby Fischer here with a pretty wild move. So, white to move, everybody. What should white play here? Notably, Fischer, for his credit, was still playing rather principled. He is now trying to force the queen out to a square like g5, where he's going to take it and trade the queens. And this is a great idea, if only it was forced. If only it were forced. But it's not forced. White can do something else. So knight c5 might be playable, by the way. I think someone said knight c6 in the chat, which I'm going to assume they meant knight c5. And yeah, that might be playable, but actually the absolute best move in the position is sort of the strange-looking rook d5. And that would have been an impressive find by anyone's standards, rook d5, leaving your queen hanging and actually forcing your opponent to take it because you are applying pressure to this knight. What's the idea? Well, the idea is after takes and takes, you have a very direct threat of playing the move rook d8 and queening your pawn. So how should black play in response? You have to stop rook d8, and so you can go knight d6. But now, after knight d6, once again, the threat is being renewed of e8 queen. Black would have to take this, and then white can take on c8. No time to take back either of these pieces, thanks to rook e8 checkmate. And in fact, there's no way to actually save the knight for black here either. You have to stop back rank checkmate with something like g6 or h6, and then white is going to be capturing this knight on e7 with, close to a winning advantage. Is white actually winning? It remains to be seen. But 2 pieces and a knight for the queen is pretty good. So rook d5 would have been an absolutely insane find. It was not played in the game, though, understandably. And white just plays queen out to g5. And unfortunately, this is going to solidly give black the advantage now. And we can understand this with our knowledge of this endgame a little bit. So what's the really important endgame principle here? Well, when a pawn is super far extended, like the pawn is on d6, it can very, very quickly become a weakness if the black king is allowed to enter the game. When can the black king enter the game? Well, the black king can enter the game when fewer major pieces are on the board. So black is using that idea earlier in the game, using endgame knowledge earlier in the game to give himself an advantage. And that's what Bobby Fischer did, and it worked out very well for him. So queen takes g5, of course, is the move for black. Knight takes g5. Now to save the knight, we see f6 securing the knight and attacking white's knight as well. Knight e4. And now, unfortunately, for black, the job is very much only half done. You still have to round up this d pawn. If you don't, then once again, you're going to be in a little bit of danger. So there are a lot of different ways to play the position. I personally would have liked to see king f7 or king f8 the most, just directly bringing the king towards the center of the board. Bobby plays the slightly strange-looking knight g6, and this one's a little over my head, but I mean, I think it's a fine move. Knight can come back to f8 and help blockade a little bit, but, a little over my head. Perhaps trying to keep these pawns a little bit at bay. Some ideas of stepping forward as well. But yeah, I would have preferred the simpler king to the center. Rook C1 was played in the game, and I think, again, this is a bad move by white. As I said before, the character of the position is if white can sort of force this d pawn through, then of course white is going to be doing very well. But as pieces come off the board, it's going to turn more and more and more in the favor of the black pieces. Why? Because then it's much easier to get the king into the game. So these rooks come off the board, and then black plays a really good move here. White is sort of threatening rook c7 with stuff like knight c5 to follow, so black just plays b6, stopping knight c5 outright. Rook c7, knight f8, definitely don't want to give up this d7 square. And now after king c2, black to move and take an advantage. It's not a difficult idea, chat, but I still want you guys to find it. So yeah, it's simple. It's the idea I've been talking about all along. It's king f7, king e6, and black is just better. So this game, I think we're obviously going to see the rest of it here, but this was the key turn in the game. This 5-6 move long series where black goes from having a queen and 2 rooks on the board to have to contend with to a single rook and a knight, and that is when the king enters the game and is able to win this pawn. And that's just a fundamental misunderstanding of the position, in my opinion, by Mednis here. White had a good position with this d-pawn, and then very, very quickly, as the queen came off the board, White was not able to find a good continuation, and the d-pawn is just going to be a weakness. So it's a really critical idea to keep in mind, not just with an advanced d-pawn in particular, but any sort of these advanced pawn positions. They're going to be better for the side with the advanced pawn, so long as the black pieces are not able to round it up, and specifically, so long as the black king cannot really enter the position to stop the pawn. If the black king has a path, has free reign to come in and help out, then it's going to turn out that because the white king is so far away, it's just going to be good for the defending side. It's tough to keep this pawn forever. The game continued with king c3, king e6, and again, we see that black is getting there first and with authority. Rook c8 was now played in the game. Of course, white is sort of making a threat here to take on c7 and go king d7, picking up this guy. So rook c8 played in the game. Now knight back to g6. And again, this sort of knight dance to f8 and then back to g6 is a little mysterious to me, but all is well for Fischer in the end. King d4 was played. And so immediately, black is not picking up this pawn, but it's worth noting that this is going to be a permanent weakness here. It's not as if, you know, the white king enters the game and everything is hunky-dory, because this white king cannot really enter the black camp, and that's, again, due to this pawn being so far entrenched in enemy territory here. h6 was the move by Fischer, just sort of solidifying his position even further. There was a check, king back to f7, rook back to c8, and now we see Bobby starting to attack with the knight as well. We see h4, and now black to move and find a concrete plan to, let's say, take this pawn on d6, right? For the moment, we did everything right. We got our king in the game. We're blockading the pawn, but we need a concrete plan to actually, finally, once and for all, capture this pawn on e6, or on d6. So what can be done? So yeah, Steve is saying that the reason for knight g6 was to come to f8 to support the rook on d7, and that might be true, but to my eyes, the knight on e5 already supports the rook on d7, so I don't know, maybe there were some ideas with f4 that Bobby was worried about, but to my eyes, I thought the knight was fine on e5, so a little bit mysterious to me, but whatever works. So yeah, the key point here is going to be this move of f5. However, Bobby didn't want to do it immediately because then perhaps knight g3 is coming with an awkward tempo to deal with. So Bobby tries to get everything and goes first g6 to defend the pawn and then f5, and now this pawn is truly indefensible. White in the game tried rook h7 check and rook takes d7, but now after knight c3, king takes d6. White is getting the pawn back on a7, but those pawns were not really equal. White had sort of pinned their hopes on the d6 pawn, and now after taking on a7, it's very, very clear that black is better. Why is black better? Well, way, way back, and this is why I went through the entire game here, way, way back, anybody remember this capture? Does anybody remember this capture, right? That weakened these two pawns, and I said, back here, white now has to understand that the endgames are not good. And so here we are in said endgame. Knight takes a7. Why is black better? Because these pawns are weak. Knight g2 played in the game, and you cannot keep this pawn on h4. If you go h5, simply gh5, and it's difficult to stop the h pawn from becoming a queen. In the game, king e5 was played, knight takes h4, king f4, putting up a good fight here, but g5 and knight g6. Black has 3 versus 1 on the king side, and that is going to be enough to win. The 2 versus 1 on the queen side is going to be far less relevant, it turns out. But, still work to be done. Practically, how do you win this? Well, of course, what you need to do is push these pawns as far up the board as you can. Bobby starts with the move a4 played by white. Bobby starts with f4 check, king g2, g4. The knight comes back to b5. And now it's a game of both containing the pawns on the queen side and not pushing too far on the king side, or else risking, of course, losing some pawns of your own. So Bobby starts with a nice centralizing move, knight e5. And this is a good move for numerous reasons. Number one, you're stopping any idea of f3, which would provoke some weaknesses perhaps by black, for black, and you are introducing some ideas of actually just attacking these pawns on the queen side as well. Threats on both sides of the board are always a good idea, even in these simplified endgames. Knight c3 came on the board for white, and Bobby continues activating the king with king e6. Knight b4 played, and then once again we see the usefulness of this knight on e5, defending squares on the king side, but ready at a moment's notice to hop to the queen side and force some concessions by white. And here, if the move a5 were to be played, simply ba5, and if you go b5, it's not nearly enough. Black would have passed pawns on both sides of the board now, and that would be enough to win. So knight c6 effectively stops white's plan of making a passed pawn. Instead, knight e5 gives up control of the f3 square, and this is what white attempts to force some weaknesses in the black camp, but Bobby simply plays h5, and that is enough. b5 now by white is the best attempt to create counterplay on the queen side still, but this knight just comes back again to its centralized outpost, forcing f takes, h takes, and then here the end is quite simply very, very, very near. Knight d3 check was played, king back to g2, knight c5, king f1, king f5, king g2, king e5, king f2, check. These moves aren't of the utmost importance, but then finally Bobby finds a winning tactic to end the game. Can't take this guy because I will promote my pawn. If you go knight e2, f3, f2. And that's sort of the end of the game. White tried king f3, but now he gets checked, and again the same idea, just g2. Knight is off limits because black will queen, and that's the end of the game. So, I guess the plan is h5, h6. Okay, so I think Chess King had a typo there. I'm not sure that anything is wrong with that plan. We can take a quick look at it. But I do like how Bobby handled it, in particular with this move, knight e5. I think knight e5 is a really instructive move to look at. Of course, the position is totally winning for black, almost regardless of what you play in that position, but knight e5 is the professional way to do it. You use this knight to support the king side, you use the knight to inhibit the queen side as well, and using the knight for both purposes, making threats on both sides of the board, is definitely always the best way to go. Here the question was what's wrong with h5. For one, you might be getting forked, but sure, we'll go king e6 first. And okay, h5 here allows a5, and it's really just a question of not needing to allow all this counterplay. For example, here, knight c6, I'm not even convinced that black is winning anymore. I think you've just given up a little bit too much in the form of this a pawn. So what's wrong with h5, h4, h3, h2? Well, the problem is allowing this counterplay on the queen side. That's why black bringing this knight to e5 was so strong, because it prevented all of the counterplay on the queen side for white. So it's balancing, pushing your pawns with, keeping an eye on that counterplay. If white had played queen f3 earlier, would black have played d takes e4 instead of d takes c4? So yeah, let me know if you guys have any other questions, by the way, and I'll take a look at that. That is pretty much that game, though, in a nutshell. Good endgame play by Bobby. But yeah, let's back up here. If queen takes f3. I was assuming the point was d takes c4, not d takes e4. And the point now is that white is not able to recapture the pawn, and black would be maintaining a pawn advantage. That's why we saw g takes f3. Okay, so if there's no other questions, I am going to move on to the second endgame of the night, which, again, from the exact same tournament. This time it's going to be an endgame between Anthony Saidy and Robert James Fischer. So Saidy is a little bit closer to a household name than the last couple games I took a look at. I think I've heard his name thrown around in some of the US chess greats. So without further ado, let's just jump into it again. I am going to go pretty quickly through the opening stages for this one. We had a symmetrical English, and that turned into an early d4 by white. And now it's some sort of weird-looking Sicilian structure, but black got an early d5 as well. We see a trade on d5 and e takes d5. Keep an eye on that for later in the game. The bishop develops. We get queen b6, a6, and now symmetrical pawns in the center. And I am going to slow down in a moment here. We see black purposefully getting rid of the bishop pair, by the way. Bobby, loves the bishops, hates playing against them, so might as well get rid of them. And I think this is as good a place as any to stop and examine the position. I'm willing to call this an endgame. So of the games we've looked at so far, this is probably the driest position. So of course, what's the big imbalance? Well, the big imbalance is we have a bishop on e3 versus a knight on f6. So the challenge here is going to be who can utilize the minor pieces the best and even utilize the rooks the best as well. And for the moment, Bobby has a slight edge as far as rook activity is concerned because he's already on the open file on c8 here. So how should we start? Well, it makes a lot of sense to start with rook c2. You just want to get the rook in the game as quickly as possible. Rook d2 by white. Now black is not interested in giving up the active rook on c2, so we saw rook f to c8. And now white, of course, wants to negate this activity advantage that black has with the rook on c2. So we saw white go for rook c2, and rook c1, highlighting the fact that this is actually a pin. The rook cannot leave the c-file for fear of rook c8. So rook c1, bishop c1. And now, here it is, in all its glory, the pure good knight versus bad bishop endgame. And that term is a little bit misleading sometimes. So what do I mean when I say that? Well, we have an endgame where for the moment, especially this d-pawn, is locked on a dark square, whereas black's pawns are locked on light squares. And white, of course, is left with the dark squared bishop. What does that mean? Well, it means that this bishop is going to be forced to serve a more passive defensive role rather than an active offensive role, right? If, for example, these pawns were shifted back a file, white could play a move like bishop f4 and actively go after the d6 pawn. But as it stands, this bishop can never legally attack this pawn on d5. So, how do you actually go about playing these positions for a win? Once again, I want to turn it over to the chat room. So what's a good way to start in this case? How should we start in this endgame? So Pip and Chuck, when we played rook c2, this rook was on d2. So b2 is actually defended. We saw rook c2, rook d2, defending that pawn. So everybody has a really good idea here. And what's that idea? The idea is to activate the king. Of course, that is sort of at the top of everyone's mind in any minor piece endgame. Any endgame where there's only one minor piece on the board. As the material gets less and less, the king becomes of more and more importance. Because The king no longer has to be worried about getting checkmated with just one piece on the board. So getting the king active is going to always be a huge part of these endgames. Of course, the question remains, what's the best way to do that? And then, putting that idea aside for the moment, the other piece, the knight, definitely needs improvement here as well. So how can we improve this knight? There were some ideas listed in the chat. Most of those revolved on getting this knight to d6, and probably they're looking at squares like c4, attacking these queenside pawns, b5, attacking the d pawn, or even f5, perhaps attacking this pawn. And I don't think these are necessarily bad ideas, but perhaps that's not the most work the knight can be doing. And for example, if you do go something like knight e4 and get met with a move like bishop f6, bishop f4 rather, it can be a little bit difficult to actually get this knight to the d6 square. So Bobby, in this case, realized that perhaps the best square for this knight is not d6, looking for these squares, but rather e6. And why is e6 such a good square? Well, because it, number one, is attacking the d pawn, forcing this bishop or the king, where, white sort of gets the choice, to passively defend it. But that's not the only reason why the knight is so good on e6. It's also notably filling in a lot of these dark squared holes in black's camp. And by defending these squares, working in tandem with the pawn, we see that the white king is very seriously starting to get entirely boxed out of black's camp. So why is black allowed to play so slowly with the knight here, going knight d7, f8, e6 in the game? Well, you can play this slowly because this knight helps create such a definitive blockade against this white king. So white's king activity is sort of never going to be an issue because the king just can't invade. So we do see Fischer actually start with the move knight d7, king f1, knight f8, king e2, and knight e6, getting this knight to a very, very good square. And I think that's something to keep in mind here. The best square for the knight in these endgames isn't always the quote-unquote most active square like c2. It's just going to be a useful square for the knight. You want a square where you can put the knight down and forget about it. You put the knight in e6 and you forget about moving it for the next 15 moves. You just never have to move this piece again. It's super secure on e6. It is serving a useful attacking purpose, and it is just solidifying black's entire position. e6 is the best square for the knight in this case. Okay, the game continues with king d3. White does defend this pawn, and we're back to the original question now of, yes, we want to activate the king, but what is the best way to do that? So, chat, once again, find me a path into the game for the black king. How do we actually get there? And yeah, everybody has the right idea here. The f5 square is sort of where black is angling to get. You want to go king f5, and what do you want to do after king f5? Well, you want to find some inroad into the position for the king. So what's the way to do that? Well, I really do like how Bobby Fischer started this. He starts with the move h5. What's the point of h5? The point is this is the path to get to f5 for black. Now maybe these other paths were working as well, but I really like starting with h5 because it is already showing the actual idea in the position for black. In order to win an endgame like this, knight versus bishop or minor piece versus minor piece endgame, the absolute most important thing is finding a path for your king into the position. Currently, of course, there is no path into the position for black, right? All of these squares are super well defended. There's no way the black king can break through. So how do you go about creating a path? Well, in this case, black is looking to push the pawns on the king's side to create that path for the king. Just continuing on here, we see bishop e3, and now no reason to dilly-dally. Black just brings the king into the game. And by the way, we see white trying to make an effort to put a few more pawns onto light squares. And now, once again, chat, we've got the king to f5. We put this pawn on h5. But how do we invade? How do we create more threats in the position? What's the next move here? And yeah, it is this move g5, which could be counterintuitive to some players. It can be a little bit, perhaps risky to put your pawns on dark squares. But what's the key here? The key is that white can't force this pawn to be on a dark square forever. Now, I want to pose a hypothetical to the chat. Say you played g6 and white played h3. Would g5 still be a good move here? Would g5 still be a good move in this position? Yes or no? And yeah, the chat room is saying no. And I think here, yes, the idea of g4 is probably a good one for white. Why is it a good one for white? Well, after, for example, h takes, king f6, now your pawn is going to be cemented on the g5 square. Your king is not going to be able to invade into the position. And yes, the principle is, for the most part, true. You want your pawns on the opposite color as the bishop in these endgames. So, just an important point I wanted to highlight. Black plays g5 here, and it is a good move, but it probably wouldn't be a good move if white could cement this pawn with the move g4. Now, in the game, king f2 was played for white, and we see black now rerouting this knight again. He's gotten the king into a good position. He has hampered his opponent with this knight on e6, and now he brings it to d8, perhaps hinting at knight to c6, but as we'll see momentarily, it was sort of a joke. The knight comes back to e6 right away. I do think e6 is a good square. King d3, king f5, and the shuffling continues for a little bit. We see f6 by black, king e2, and now, once again, the question remains, how are you actually going to continue with black in this case? So, chat room, once again, how do you continue with black here? What would be a better idea there? That's a great question, Curious Thought, and probably going to answer it with the moves played in the game. So yeah, let's talk about g4. What's happening with g4? Well, I think it's a classic case of if white were to capture, we would be super, super happy. Why are we so happy? Well, we've gained the e4 square, and that's the path we needed for our king. But unfortunately, it's one of those cases where captures are not forced in chess. If black, for example, passes, the best we can do is g takes f3, and after g takes f3, seemingly white is holding the fort here. It's difficult to make any inroads with the king. And so I don't think g4 is actually quite enough in this case. So perhaps realizing that, Bobby actually comes up with a pretty radically different idea. Rohit wants to offer a draw, and it wouldn't be totally out of the question, but let me check very quickly what round this was. Yeah, this was round 11. So this is it if you're Bobby Fischer. You're in the final round. You have to win this game to get your perfect score. No way is he offering a draw here and getting 10.5 out of 11. That would be obscene. So I don't think b5 is actually the worst move. It's a pretty good suggestion. Why is b5 an okay move? Well, you're hinting at some ideas of doing something radically different and actually stepping to the queen side of the board. So let's look at that very briefly. b5, and the point is, these weaknesses aren't ever really going to be relevant because the knight can always step to c6, so the king is never really going to make it in. But b5, not Bobby Fischer's idea. And yeah, Magikarp in the chat is the first one I've seen with the correct idea, which is to actually try to put this pawn onto f4. Why is this going to be so good for black? Well, looking at it, in particular with this g4 idea, if you imagine in these positions that we had put our pawn on f4 instead, now all of a sudden these become very, very tangible threats. Knight g5 becomes a very tangible threat. and suddenly the paths for the black king become a little bit clear. So black, in this case, takes more space with king g6, f5, f4. And I think this is the right way to go now for black. Bobby follows this up with the move knight g7, and to be honest, I think probably the best idea here for black was just immediately, go get the guy with g4. After knight g7, white is able to play this move h3 and is able to hold on a little bit longer with some control over this square. That being said, I don't think white is totally out of the woods just yet by any means. Bobby follows up with knight f5, and this was sort of the secondary idea of f5, f4. It gives the knight this square, and now there are ideas of hopping in and exploiting the weakness on g2 as well. King d3 played in the game, and now Bobby does get kind of a worse version of what we were looking at with the move g4. And I think here this is why g4 immediately was just a bit better. I do think this is the right idea for black. I don't really see how else you make any progress in the position, but the point is, could have had it a little bit better with g4 earlier. Okay, h takes g, played in the game. What else? H takes, and now f takes. White has to actually capture this pawn, or else if white doesn't, then, it's difficult to even play a move here. For example, g3, bishop g1, knight h4, king f1, and you're dead. You can't move your pieces. You can't move your pieces. Just zugged. Just zugged. Unfortunate here for white. So, takes on g4 is forced. Now knight h6 is pressuring this piece. And I think here the game was adjourned for a period of time. White sealed his next move, and the game was adjourned. So white is actually holding on to the game here with accurate play. It turns out, had white immediately after black plays this g4 move to open things up, had white immediately brought the king back in order to try and defend these light squares, you can go bishop g1 here, just barely defending with just enough squares, and go king f3. And here white is for the moment holding on to everything. Would white draw the game? Probably that's the direction this game would have been headed if this is what had been played. Things are starting to get a little bit more simpler. Black has not successfully invaded, and white has put up a very tenacious defense. But that's not what was played. In the game after knight h6, white's sealed move was the move bishop e1. And this move is very much the losing move here for white. It's just not defending these light squares quickly enough. Knight takes g4, played in the game, bishop d2, king f5 now, bishop back to e1. And now after knight f6, we have our path in. And that is all you need to win in these endgames. Bishop h4 was played, knight into e4, bishop back to e1. The king does invade now with king g4. And after king g2, once again, you have sort of improved as much as you can. So what is the knockout blow here? Black has done very, very well so far to put on the pressure, and we are sort of seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, but how do you actually make it there? So black to move and find the winning idea. Knight g3 check is certainly a move, but is it a winning idea? The game would probably continue after knight g3 check. If I had to guess, the game would continue. You can't play knight g3 and then hold out your hand for resignation. They will not resign. Knight d6, knight f5. Again, I don't think the game is ending after you put the knight on f5. I'm asking you guys for the winning plan here, the winning idea, not just a move. Okay, I think this one is asking a bit much of the chat. They're all suggesting various knight moves, but I'm not seeing any sort of coherent idea here. It's great to have the knight on f5, you're attacking a pawn, but of course, white is going to defend the pawn. the game doesn't end. The game doesn't end. And yeah, now Chess King is sort of arriving at the point. It's great that we can attack the d4 pawn. It's what we've been doing for the majority of this game. But of course, one weakness is not enough to win a chess game. And now the key is Bobby can take advantage of the weak pawn on g2 as well. That's going to be the key here. So we do actually start with the move knight g3 check. By the way, if you take this, king takes is going to be winning by force, when the d-pawn will quite easily fall. So the king must move. The king moved to d3 in the game. Now knight f5, and white plays bishop f2. But here the winning idea is to go knight f4. Yeah, knight h4 rather. And now this pawn is quite simply indefensible, and black wins the game. Notably, if white had gone the other way with the king here, knight f5, bishop c3, this perhaps would have been a better attempt at holding on, but here black can actually go knight e3, and knight d1 check is going to be a difficult threat to sort of contend with. For example, if you go a5, knight d1 check, if the king goes this way, then we'll trade and get the same problem as last time. And if the king goes this way, for example, then again, this idea of knight takes bishop and f3 is going to be winning the game. So that might have been a better try, but king d3 played in the game, bishop f2, knight h4, and now this pawn just falls. No way to save it, knight takes pawn, and the king invades, and resignation occurs very, very shortly after. So that was the 11th and final win by Bobby Fischer in this U.S. Championships. We do have a few minutes left, so I'm going to open it up to any questions on this endgame and then recap a little bit what we just looked at. So any questions on this endgame? This was, I think, perhaps one of the most difficult games for Bobby throughout the entire tournament. Saidy definitely did not make it easy on Bobby Fischer to get that 11th and final win. So any questions? And wow, thank you all so much for watching. Seeing 280 people on the show here live, and that's, I think, a bit above my normal numbers. Thank you all so much. Okay, no real questions, so recapping briefly. Well, Pip and Chuck wants me to go back to the starting position, which I'm going to do anyways, because this is going to be a recap. So once again, we had this endgame with the rooks. Rook c2, rook d2, which once again defends the b-pawn. The rooks came off the board, and we had this starting position of the endgame. Black understood that e6 is actually going to be the best square for this knight to start with. While black sort of organizes his forces, this knight is going to keep all of the enemy pieces sort of at bay on the e6 square. By the way, there was sort of a quick question, why can't white just sort of invade over here? And I think the answer is that as soon as you get super far over here, you're going to find yourself running into the fact that black's play is just coming a bit faster. For example, king b6, knight d4, and this is going to be pretty advantageous for black with the passed d-pawn coming a bit more quickly than these pawns on the queen's side. Also notably, I don't think black actually has to allow you to get so far in. For example, king g6 if you go f3, king f5 if you go king b4. What's going on here? Well, you can go b6 at worst case, and then the king will have to return back to sanity. So that was a good question I spotted earlier, and the answer is basically either black can just take the d-pawn, or if white plays a bit more conservatively, black can always play b6 to keep the king out of the game. And then we saw Bobby trying to create inroads for his king over on the king's side, and that's the way to go. Then he comes up with this nice idea of putting the pawn on f4, gaining even more space and cementing these pawns here to create more weaknesses in the position. And then finally, we see the losing move, bishop e1, allowing this king into the game with too much space, too many threats, and that is the game. Young Turtle asks, how deep do you usually calculate in the endgames? I always feel weird calculating along lines when there are still pieces on the board. So principles exist for a reason. So whenever you're thinking about should I trade into sort of an endgame, it can be difficult to actually calculate everything out, and that's why principles can be a little bit helpful, as in that first game we saw this pawn on d6, and it's more of a principled approach to just trade the pieces than a thoroughly calculated line to lead to trading pieces there for black. As far as how deep do I usually calculate, or does a good player usually calculate, it depends on the end game. Some end games you can calculate very, very long lines. Some end games you rely more on those principles. Same endgame was played by two modern grandmasters today. Do you think black would still win? So that's one of those weird questions that is sort of best answered by, just a range of probabilities. Probably some of the times black is going to win, some of the times white is going to draw. Probably white's not going to win any of the games, but depends on the grandmasters, depends on their form, depends on the time control, depends on a lot of things. I think a lot of the time black would still win, but definitely a lot of the time white would be able to draw as well. Endgame skills have really gone up in the past 60 years. Okay, I am going to call it quits here for the lecture. Thank you all so much for joining. As always, the action is going to continue live on Twitch TV, where I will be doing analyze your games. So if you have a game you would like me to analyze rather than the game of U.S. champions, the games of U.S. champions, go ahead and head over to the Twitch channel, send me a link there, and I'll be happy to go over some of your games instead. As always, thank you guys so much for watching this edition of the Endgame class. My name is Caleb Denby, and I will see you next time.